The Abominable History of the Man with Copper Fingers. The Egotists Club is one of the most genial places in London. It is a place to which you may go when you want to tell that odd dream you had last night, or to announce what a good dentist you have discovered. You can write letters there if you like, and have the temperament of a Jane Austen, for there is no silence room, and it would be a breach of club manners to appear busy or absorbed when another member addresses you. You must not mention golf or fish, however, and if the Honourable Freddie Arbuthnot's motion is carried at the next committee meeting, and opinion so far appears very favourable, you will not be allowed to mention wireless either. As Lord Peter Wimsey said when the matter was mooted the other day in the smoking room, those are things you can talk about anywhere. Otherwise the club is not specially exclusive. Nobody is ineligible per se, except strong, silent men. Nominees are, however, required to pass certain tests, whose nature is sufficiently indicated by the fact that a certain distinguished explorer came to grief through accepting and smoking a powerful Trichinopoly cigar as an accompaniment to a 63 port. On the other hand, dear old Sir Roger Bunt, the Coster millionaire who won the £20,000 ballot offered by the Sunday Shriek, and used it to found his immense catering business in the Midlands, was highly commended and unanimously elected after declaring frankly that beer and a pipe were all he really cared for in that way. As Lord Peter said again, nobody minds coarseness, but one must draw the line at cruelty. On this particular evening, Masterman the Cubist poet had brought a guest with him, a man named Varden. Varden had started life as a professional athlete, but a strained heart had obliged him to cut short a brilliant career, and turn his handsome face and remarkably beautiful body to account in the service of the cinema screen. He had come to London from Los Angeles to stimulate publicity for his great new film, Marathon, and turned out to be quite a pleasant, unspoiled person, greatly to the relief of the club. Since Masterman's guests were apt to be something of a toss-up, there were only 8 men, including Varden, in the brown room that evening. This, with its panelled walls, shaded lamps and heavy blue curtains, was perhaps the cosiest and pleasantest of the small smoking rooms, of which the club possessed half a dozen or so. The conversation had begun quite casually by Armstrong's relating a curious little incident which he had witnessed that afternoon at the Temple station, and Bayes had gone on to say that that was nothing to the really very odd thing which had happened to him, personally, in a thick fog one night in the Euston Road. Masterman said that the more secluded London squares teemed with subjects for a writer, and instanced his own singular encounter with a weeping woman and a dead monkey, and then Judson took up the tale and narrated how, in a lonely suburb, late at night, he had come upon the dead body of a woman stretched on the pavement with a knife in her side, and a policeman standing motionless nearby. He had asked if he could do anything, but the policeman had only said, "I wouldn't interfere if I was you, sir. She deserved what she got." Judson said he had not been able to get the incident out of his mind, and then Pettifer told them of a queer case in his own medical practice, when a totally unknown man had led him to a house in Bloomsbury where there was a woman suffering from strychnine poisoning. This man had helped him in the most intelligent manner all night, and when the patient was out of danger, had walked straight out of the house and never reappeared. The odd thing being that when Pettifer questioned the woman, she answered in great surprise that she had never seen the man in her life, and had taken him to be Pettifer's assistant. "That reminds me," said Varden, "of something still stranger that happened to me once in New York. I've never been able to make out whether it was a madman or a practical joke, or whether I really had a very narrow shave." This sounded promising, and the guest was urged to go on with his story. "Well, it really started ages ago," said the actor. 7 years it must have been, just before America came into the war. I was 25 at the time, and had been in the film business a little over 2 years. There was a man called Eric P. Loder, pretty well known in New York at that period, who would have been a very fine sculptor if he hadn't had more money than was good for him, or so I understood from the people who go in for that kind of thing. He used to exhibit a good deal and had a lot of one-man shows of his stuff to which the highbrow people went. He did a good many bronzes, I believe. Perhaps you know about him, Masterman." "I've never seen any of his things," said the poet, "but I remember some photographs in the Art of Tomorrow. Clever, but rather overripe. Didn't he go in for a lot of that chryselephantine stuff? Just to show he could afford to pay for the materials, I suppose." "Yes, that sounds very like him." "Of course. And he did a very slick and very ugly realistic group called Lucina, and had the impudence to have it cast in solid gold and stood in his front hall." "Oh, that thing. Yes, simply beastly, I thought it. But then I never could see anything artistic in the idea. Realism, I suppose you'd call it. I like a picture or a statue to make you feel good. Or what's it there for? Still, there was something very attractive about Loder." "How did you come across him?" "Oh, yes. Well, he saw me in that little picture of mine, Apollo Comes to New York. Perhaps you remember it. It was my first star part. About a statue that's brought to life, one of the old gods, you know, and how he gets on in a modern city. Dear old Rubensson produced it. Now, there was a man who could put a thing through with consummate artistry. You couldn't find an atom of offence from beginning to end. It was all so tasteful, though in the first part one didn't have anything to wear except a sort of scarf taken from the classical statue, you know. The Belvedere, I dare say. Well, Loder wrote to me and said as a sculptor he was interested in me because I was a good shape and so on, and would I come and pay him a visit in New York when I was free. So I found out about Loder and decided it would be good publicity, and when my contract was up and I had a bit of time to fill in, I went up east and called on him. He was very decent to me and asked me to stay a few weeks with him while I was looking around. He had a magnificent great house about 5 miles out of the city, crammed full of pictures and antiques and so on. He was somewhere between 35 and 40, I should think, dark and smooth, and very quick and lively in his movements. He talked very well, seemed to have been everywhere and have seen everything and not to have any too good an opinion of anybody. You could sit and listen to him for hours. He'd got anecdotes about everybody, from the Pope to old Phineas E. Groot of the Chicago Ring. The only kind of story I didn't care about hearing from him was the improper sort. Not that I don't enjoy an after-dinner story. No, sir, I wouldn't like you to think I was a prig, but he'd tell it with his eye upon you, as if he suspected you of having something to do with it. I've known women do that, and I've seen men do it to women and seen the women squirm, but he was the only man that's ever given me that feeling. Still, apart from that, Loder was the most fascinating fellow I've ever known. And, as I say, his house surely was beautiful, and he kept a first-class table. He liked to have everything of the best. There was his mistress, Maria Morano. I don't think I've ever seen anything to touch her. And when you work for the screen, you're apt to have a pretty exacting standard of female beauty. She was one of those big, slow, beautifully moving creatures, very placid, with a slow, wide smile. We don't grow them in the States. She'd come from the South, had been a cabaret dancer, he said, and she didn't contradict him. He was very proud of her, and she seemed to be devoted to him in her own fashion. He'd show her off in the studio with nothing on but a fig leaf, or so stand her up beside one of the figures he was always doing of her, and compare them point by point. There was literally only 1/2 inch of her, it seemed, that wasn't absolutely perfect from the sculptor's point of view. The second toe of her left foot was shorter than the big toe. He used to correct it, of course, in the statues. She'd listen to it all with a good-natured smile, sort of vaguely flattered, you know, though I think the poor girl sometimes got tired of being gloated over that way. She'd sometimes hunt me out and confide to me that what she had always hoped for was to run a restaurant of her own. with a cabaret show, and a great many cooks with white aprons, and lots of polished electric cookers. And then I would marry, she'd say, and have 4 sons and 1 daughter. And she told me all the names she had chosen for the family. I thought it was rather pathetic. Loder came in at the end of one of these conversations. He had a sort of a grin on, so I dare say he'd overheard. I don't suppose he attached much importance to it, which shows that he never really understood the girl. I don't think he ever imagined any woman would chuck up the sort of life he'd accustomed her to, and if he was a bit possessive in his manner, at least he never gave her a rival. For all his talk and his ugly statues, she'd got him, and she knew it. I stayed there getting on for a month altogether, having a thundering good time. On 2 occasions Loder had an art spasm, and shut himself up in his studio to work, and wouldn't let anybody in for several days on end. He was rather given to that sort of stunt, and when it was over we would have a party, and all Loder's friends and hangers-on would come to have a look at the work of art. He was doing a figure of some nymph or goddess, I fancy, to be cast in silver, and Marie used to go along and sit for him. Apart from those times he went about everywhere, and we saw all there was to be seen. I was fairly annoyed, I admit, when it came to an end. War was declared, and I'd made up my mind to join up when that happened. My heart put me out of the running for trench service, but I counted on getting some sort of a job, with perseverance, so I packed up and went off. I wouldn't have believed Loder would have been so genuinely sorry to say goodbye to me. He said over and over again that we'd meet again soon. However, I did get a job with the hospital people, and was sent over to Europe, and it wasn't till 1920 that I saw Loder again. He'd written to me before, but I'd had 2 big pictures to make in 19, and it couldn't be done. However, in 20 I found myself back in New York, doing publicity for the Passion Streak, and got a note from Loder begging me to stay with him, and saying he wanted me to sit for him. Well, that was advertisement, that he'd pay for himself, you know. So I agreed. I had accepted an engagement to go out with Mr. Films Limited in Jake of Dead Man's Bush the Dwarfman picture, you know, taken on the spot among the Australian bushmen. I wired them that I would join them at Sydney the 3rd week in April, and took my bags out to Loder's. Loder greeted me very cordially, though I thought he looked older than when I last saw him. He had certainly grown more nervous in his manner. He was, how shall I describe it, more real, in a way. He brought out his pet cynicisms as if he thoroughly meant them, and more with that air of getting at you personally. I used to think his disbelief in everything was a kind of artistic pose, but I began to feel I had done him an injustice. He was really unhappy. I could see that quite well, and soon I discovered the reason. As we were driving out in the car, I asked after Maria. "She has left me," he said. Well, now, you know, that really surprised me. Honestly, I hadn't thought the girl had that much initiative. "Why?" I said. "Has she gone and set up in that restaurant of her own she wanted so much?" "Oh, she talked to you about restaurants, did she?" said Loder. "I suppose you are one of the men that women tell things to." "No. She made a fool of herself. She's gone." I didn't quite know what to say. He was so obviously hurt in his vanity, you know, as well as in his feelings. I muttered the usual things, and added that it must be a great loss to his work as well as in other ways. He said it was. I asked him when it had happened, and whether he'd finished the nymph he was working on before I left. He said, oh yes, he'd finished that and done another something pretty original, which I should like. Well, we got to the house and dined, and Loder told me he was going to Europe shortly, a few days after I left myself. In fact, the nymph stood in the dining room, in a special niche let into the wall. It really was a beautiful thing, not so showy as most of Loder's work, and a wonderful likeness of Maria. Loder put me opposite it, so that I could see it during dinner, and really, I could hardly take my eyes off it. He seemed very proud of it, and kept on telling me over and over again how glad he was that I liked it. It struck me that he was falling into a trick of repeating himself. We went into the smoking room after dinner. He'd had it rearranged, and the first thing that caught one's eye was a big settee drawn before the fire. It stood about a couple of feet from the ground, and consisted of a base made like a Roman couch, with cushions and a highish back, all made of oak with a silver inlay, and on top of this, forming the actual seat one sat on, if you follow me, there was a great silver figure of a nude woman, fully life-size, lying with her head back and her arms extended along the sides of the couch. A few big loose cushions made it possible to use the thing as an actual settee, though I must say it never was really comfortable to sit on respectably, as a stage prop. For registering dissipation it would have been excellent, but to see Loder sprawling over it by his own fireside gave me a kind of shock. He seemed very much attached to it, though. "I told you," he said, "that it was something original." Then I looked more closely at it and saw that the figure actually was Maria's, though the face was rather sketchily done, if you understand what I mean. I suppose he thought a bolder treatment more suited to a piece of furniture. But I did begin to think Loder a trifle degenerate when I saw that couch, and in the fortnight that followed, I grew more and more uncomfortable with him. That personal manner of his grew more marked every day, and sometimes, while I was giving him sittings, he would sit there and tell one of the most beastly things, with his eyes fixed on one in the nastiest way, just to see how one would take it. Upon my word, though he certainly did me uncommonly well, I began to feel I'd be more at ease among the bushmen. Well, now I come to the odd thing. Everybody sat up and listened a little more eagerly. "It was the evening before I had to leave New York," went on Varden. "I was sitting. Here somebody opened the door of the brown room to be greeted by a warning sign from Bayes. The intruder sank obscurely into a large chair and mixed himself a whiskey with extreme care not to disturb the speaker. I was sitting in the smoking room," continued Varden, "waiting for Loder to come in. I had the house to myself, for Loder had given the servants leave to go to some show or lecture or other, and he himself was getting his things together for his European trip, and had had to keep an appointment with his man of business. I must have been very nearly asleep, because it was dusk when I came to with a start, and saw a young man quite close to me. He wasn't at all like a housebreaker, and still less like a ghost. He was, I might almost say, exceptionally ordinary-looking. He was dressed in a grey English suit, with a fawn overcoat on his arm, and his soft hat and stick in his hand. He had sleek, pale hair, and one of those rather stupid faces, with a long nose and a monocle. I stared at him, for I knew the front door was locked, but before I could get my wits together he spoke. He had a curious, hesitating, husky voice and a strong English accent. He said surprisingly, "Are you Mr. Varden?" "You have the advantage of me," I said. He said, "Please excuse my butting in. I know it looks like bad manners, but you'd better clear out of this place very quickly, don't you know?" "What the hell do you mean?" I said. He said, "I don't mean it in any impertinent way, but you must realize that Loder's never forgiven you, and I'm afraid he means to make you into a hat stand or an electric light fitting or something of that sort." My God! I can tell you I felt queer. It was such a quiet voice, and his manners were perfect, and yet the words were quite meaningless. I remembered that madmen are supposed to be extra strong, and edged towards the bell, and then it came over me with rather a chill that I was alone in the house. "How did you get here?" I asked, putting a bold face on it. "I'm afraid I picked the lock," he said, as casually as though he were apologizing for not having a card about him. "I couldn't be sure Loder hadn't come back, but I do really think you had better get out as quickly as possible." "See here," I said, "who are you and what the hell are you driving at? What do you mean about Loder never forgiving me? Forgiving me what?" "Why," he said, You will pardon me prancing in on your private affairs, won't you, about Maria Marano? What about her, in the devil's name? I cried. What do you know about her, anyway? She went off while I was at the war. What's it to do with me? Oh, said the very odd young man, I beg your pardon. Perhaps I have been relying too much on Loder's judgment. Damned foolish. But the possibility of his being mistaken did not occur to me. He fancies you were Maria Marano's lover when you were here last time. Maria's lover? I said. Preposterous. She went off with her man, whoever he was. He must know she didn't go with me. Maria never left the house, said the young man, and if you don't get out of it this moment, I won't answer for your ever leaving, either. In God's name, I cried, exasperated. What do you mean? The man turned and threw the blue cushions off the foot of the silver couch. Have you ever examined the toes of this? He asked. Not particularly, I said, more and more astonished. Why should I? Did you ever know Loder make any figure of her but this with that short toe on the left foot? He went on. Well, I did take a look at it then, and saw it was as he said. The left foot had a short second toe. So it is, I said, but after all, why not? Why not indeed, said the young man. Wouldn't you like to see why, of all the figures Loder made of Maria Marano, this is the only one that has the feet of the living woman? He picked up the poker. Look, he said. With a lot more strength than I should have expected from him, he brought the head of the poker down with a heavy crack on the silver couch. It struck one of the arms of the figure neatly at the elbow joint, smashing a jagged hole in the silver. He wrenched at the arm and brought it away. It was hollow, and as I am alive, I tell you there was a long, dry arm bone inside it. Varden paused and put away a good mouthful of whiskey. Well? Cried several breathless voices. Well, said Varden, I'm not ashamed to say I went out of that house like an old buck rabbit that hears the man with the gun. There was a car standing just outside, and the driver opened the door. I tumbled in, and then it came over me that the whole thing might be a trap, and I tumbled out again and ran till I reached the trolley cars, but I found my bags at the station next day, duly registered for Vancouver. When I pulled myself together, I did rather wonder what Loder was thinking about my disappearance, but I could no more have gone back into that horrible house than I could have taken poison. I left for Vancouver next morning, and from that day to this, I never saw either of those men again. I've still not the faintest idea who the fair man was, or what became of him, but I heard in a roundabout way that Loder was dead in some kind of an accident, I fancy. There was a pause. Then, it's a damned good story, Mr. Varden, said Armstrong. He was a dabbler in various kinds of handiwork, and was indeed chiefly responsible for Mr. Arbuthnot's motion to ban wireless. But are you suggesting there was a complete skeleton inside that silver casting? Do you mean Loder put it into the core of the mould when the casting was done? It would be awfully difficult and dangerous. The slightest accident would have put him at the mercy of his workmen, and that statue must have been considerably over life-size to allow of the skeleton being well covered. Mr. Varden has unintentionally misled you, Armstrong, said a quiet, husky voice suddenly from the shadow behind Varden's chair. The figure was not silver, but electro-plated on a copper base deposited direct on the body. The lady was Sheffield-plated, in fact. I fancy the soft parts of her must have been digested away with pepsin, or some preparation of the kind, after the process was complete, but I can't be positive about that. "Hullo, Wimsey," said Armstrong. "Was that you came in just now? And why this confident pronouncement?" The effect of Wimsey's voice on Varden had been extraordinary. He had leapt to his feet and turned the lamp so as to light up Wimsey's face. "Good evening, Mr. Varden," said Lord Peter. "I'm delighted to meet you again and to apologize for my unceremonious behavior on the occasion of our last encounter." Varden took the proffered hand and was speechless. "Do you mean to say, you mad mystery-monger, that you were Varden's great unknown?" demanded Bayes. "Ah, well," he added rudely, "we might have guessed it from his vivid description." "Well, since you're here," said Smith Hartington, the Morning Yell man, "I think you ought to come across with the rest of the story." "Was it just a joke?" asked Judson. "Of course not," interrupted Pettifer, before Lord Peter had time to reply. "Why should it be? Whimsy's seen enough queer things not to have to waste his time inventing them." "That's true enough," said Bayes. "Comes of having deductive powers and all that sort of thing, and always sticking one's nose into things that are better not investigated." "That's all very well, Bayes," said his lordship. "But if I hadn't just mentioned the matter to Mr. Varden that evening, where would he be?" "Ah, where? That's exactly what we want to know," demanded Smith Hartington. "Come on, Whimsy, no shirking, we must have the tale." "And the whole tale," added Pettifer. "And nothing but the tale," said Armstrong, dexterously whisking away the whisky bottle and the cigars from under Lord Peter's nose. "Get on with it, old son. Not a smoke do you smoke, and not a sup do you sip, till Bird Ellen is set free." "Brute," said his lordship plaintively. "As a matter of fact," he went on with a change of tone, "it's not really a story I want to get about. It might land me in a very unpleasant sort of position, manslaughter probably, and murder possibly." "Gosh," said Bayes. "That's all right," said Armstrong. "Nobody's going to talk. We can't afford to lose you from the club, you know. Smith Hartington will have to control his passion for copy, that's all." Pledges of discretion having been given all round, Lord Peter settled himself back and began his tale. The curious case of Eric P. Loder affords one more instance of the strange manner in which some power beyond our puny human wills arranges the affairs of men. Call it providence, call it destiny. "We'll call it off," said Bayes. "You can leave out that part." Lord Peter groaned and began again. "Well, the first thing that made me feel a bit inquisitive about Loder was a casual remark by a man at the emigration office in New York, where I happened to go about that silly affair of Mrs. Biltz. He said, 'What on earth is Eric Loder going to do in Australia?' I should have thought Europe was more in his line." "Australia?" I said. "You're wandering, dear old thing. He told me the other day he was off to Italy in 3 weeks' time." "Italy nothing," he said. "He was all over our place today, asking about how you got to Sydney and what were the necessary formalities and so on." "Oh," I said, "I suppose he's going by the Pacific route and calling at Sydney on his way." But I wondered why he hadn't said so when I'd met him the day before. He had distinctly talked about sailing for Europe and doing Paris before he went on to Rome. I felt so darned inquisitive that I went and called on Loder 2 nights later. He seemed quite pleased to see me and was full of his forthcoming trip. I asked him again about his route, and he told me quite distinctly he was going via Paris. Well, that was that, and it wasn't really any of my business, and we chatted about other things. He told me that Mr. Varden was coming to stay with him before he went, and that he hoped to get him to pose for a figure before he left. He said he'd never seen a man so perfectly formed. I meant to get him to do it before, he said, but war broke out, and he went and joined the army before I had time to start. He was lolling on that beastly couch of his at the time, and happening to look round at him, I caught such a nasty sort of glitter in his eye that it gave me quite a turn. He was stroking the figure over the neck and grinning at it. "None of your efforts in Sheffield Plate, I hope," said I. "Well," he said, "I thought of making a kind of companion to this, the sleeping athlete, you know, or something of that sort." "You'd much better cast it," I said. "Why did you put the stuff on so thick? It destroys the fine detail." That annoyed him. He never liked to hear any objection made to that work of art. "This was experimental," he said. "I mean the next to be a real masterpiece. You'll see." We'd got to about that point when the butler came in to ask should he make up a bed for me, as it was such a bad night. We hadn't noticed the weather particularly. though it had looked a bit threatening when I started from New York. However, we now looked out and saw that it was coming down in sheets and torrents. It wouldn't have mattered, only that I'd only brought a little open racing car and no overcoat, and certainly the prospect of 5 miles in that downpour wasn't altogether attractive. Loder urged me to stay, and I said I would. I was feeling a bit fagged, so I went to bed right off. Loder said he wanted to do a bit of work in the studio first, and I saw him depart along the corridor. You won't allow me to mention Providence, so I'll only say it was a very remarkable thing that I should have woken up at 2 in the morning to find myself lying in a pool of water. The man had stuck a hot water bottle into the bed because it hadn't been used just lately, and the beastly thing had gone and unstopped itself. I lay awake for 10 minutes in the deeps of damp misery before I had sufficient strength of mind to investigate. Then I found it was hopeless sheets, blankets, mattress, all soaked. I looked at the armchair, and then I had a brilliant idea. I remembered there was a lovely great divan in the studio, with a big skin rug and a pile of cushions. Why not finish the night there? I took the little electric torch which always goes about with me and started off. The studio was empty, so I supposed Loder had finished and trotted off to roost. The divan was there all right, with a screen drawn partly across it, so I rolled myself up under the rug and prepared to snooze off. I was just getting beautifully sleepy again when I heard footsteps, not in the passage, but apparently on the other side of the room. I was surprised, because I didn't know there was any way out in that direction. I lay low, and presently I saw a streak of light appear from the cupboard, where Loder kept his tools and things. The streak widened, and Loder emerged, carrying an electric torch. He closed the cupboard door very gently after him, and padded across the studio. He stopped before the easel and uncovered it. I could see him through a crack in the screen. He stood for some minutes gazing at a sketch on the easel, and then gave one of the nastiest gurgly laughs I've ever had the pleasure of hearing. If I'd ever seriously thought of announcing my unauthorized presence, I abandoned all idea of it then. Presently he covered the easel again and went out by the door at which I had come in. I waited till I was sure he had gone, and then got up, uncommonly quietly, I may say. I tiptoed over to the easel to see what the fascinating work of art was. I saw at once it was the design for the figure of the sleeping athlete, and as I looked at it I felt a sort of horrid conviction stealing over me. It was an idea which seemed to begin in my stomach and work its way up to the roots of my hair. My family say I'm too inquisitive. I can only say that wild horses wouldn't have kept me from investigating that cupboard. With the feeling that something absolutely vile might hop out at me, I was a bit wrought up, and it was a rotten time of night. I put a heroic hand on the doorknob. To my astonishment, the thing wasn't even locked. It opened at once to show a range of perfectly innocent and orderly shelves, which couldn't possibly have held Loder. My blood was up, you know, by this time, so I hunted round for the spring lock which I knew must exist, and found it without much difficulty. The back of the cupboard swung noiselessly inwards, and I found myself at the top of a narrow flight of stairs. I had the sense to stop and see that the door could be opened from the inside before I went any farther, and I also selected a good stout pestle which I found on the shelves as a weapon in case of accident. Then I closed the door and tripped with elf-like lightness down that jolly old staircase. There was another door at the bottom, but it didn't take me long to fathom the secret of that. Feeling frightfully excited, I threw it boldly open, with the pestle ready for action. However, the room seemed to be empty. My torch caught the gleam of something liquid, and then I found the wall switch. I saw a biggish square room, fitted up as a workshop. On the right-hand wall was a big switchboard, with a bench beneath it. From the middle of the ceiling hung a great floodlight, illuminating a glass vat, fully 7 feet long by about 3 wide. I turned on the floodlight and looked down into the vat. It was filled with a dark brown liquid, which I recognized as the usual compound of cyanide and copper sulfate which they use for copper plating. The rods hung over it with their hooks all empty, but there was a packing case half opened at one side of the room, and pulling the covering aside, I could see rows of copper anodes, enough of them to put a plating over 1/4 of an inch thick on a life-size figure. There was a smaller case, still nailed up, which from its weight and appearance I guessed to contain the silver for the rest of the process. There was something else I was looking for, and I soon found it: a considerable quantity of prepared graphite and a big jar of varnish. Of course, there was no evidence, really, of anything being on the cross. There was no reason why Loder shouldn't make a plaster cast and Sheffield plate it if he had a fancy for that kind of thing. But then I found something that couldn't have come there legitimately. On the bench was an oval slab of copper about 1.5 inches long, Loder's night's work, I guessed. It was an electrotype of the American consular seal, the thing they stamp on your passport photograph to keep you from hiking it off and substituting the picture of your friend, Mr. Jiggs, who would like to get out of the country because he is so popular with Scotland Yard. I sat down on Loder's stool and worked out that pretty little plot in all its details. I could see it all turned on 3 things. First of all, I must find out if Varden was proposing to make tracks shortly for Australia, because, if he wasn't, it threw all my beautiful theories out. And, secondly, it would help matters greatly if he happened to have dark hair like Loder's, as he has, you see, near enough anyway, to fit the description on a passport. I'd only seen him in that Apollo Belvedere thing with a fair wig on, but I knew if I hung about I should see him presently when he came to stay with Loder. And thirdly, of course, I had to discover if Loder was likely to have any grounds for a grudge against Varden. Well, I figured out I'd stay down in that room about as long as was healthy. Loder might come back at any moment, and I didn't forget that a vat full of copper sulfate and cyanide of potassium would be a highly handy means of getting rid of a too inquisitive guest. And I can't say I had any great fancy for figuring as part of Loder's domestic furniture. I've always hated things made in the shape of things, volumes of Dickens that turn out to be a biscuit tin, and dodges like that. And, though I take no overwhelming interest in my own funeral, I should like it to be in good taste. I went so far as to wipe away any finger marks I might have left behind me, and then I went back to the studio and rearranged that divan. I didn't feel Loder would care to think I'd been down there. There was just one other thing I felt inquisitive about. I tiptoed back through the hall and into the smoking room. The silver couch glimmered in the light of the torch. I felt I disliked it 50 times more than ever before. However, I pulled myself together and took a careful look at the feet of the figure. I'd heard all about that second toe of Maria Marano's. I passed the rest of the night in the armchair after all. What with Mrs. Bilt's job and one thing and another, and the inquiries I had to make, I had to put off my interference in Loder's little game till rather late. I found out that Varden had been staying with Loder a few months before the beautiful Maria Marano had vanished. I'm afraid I was rather stupid about that, Mr. Varden. I thought perhaps there had been something. Don't apologize, said Varden with a little laugh. Cinema actors are notoriously immoral. Why rub it in, said Whimsy, a trifle hurt. I apologize. Anyway, it came to the same thing as far as Loder was concerned. Then there was one bit of evidence I had to get to be absolutely certain. Electroplating, especially such a ticklish job as the one I had in mind, wasn't a job that could be finished in a night. On the other hand, it seemed necessary that Mr. Varden should be seen alive in New York up to the day he was scheduled to depart. It was also clear that Loder meant to be able to prove that a Mr. Varden had left New York all right, according to plan, and had actually arrived in Sydney. Accordingly, a false Mr. Varden was to depart with Varden's papers and Varden's passport, furnished with a new photograph duly stamped with the consular stamp. and to disappear quietly at Sydney and be retransformed into Mr. Eric Loader, travelling with a perfectly regular passport of his own. Well then, in that case, obviously a cablegram would have to be sent off to Mr. Films Limited, warning them to expect Varden by a later boat than he had arranged. I handed over this part of the job to my man, Bunter, who is uncommonly capable. The devoted fellow shadowed Loader faithfully for getting on for 3 weeks, and at length, the very day before Mr. Varden was due to depart. The cablegram was sent from an office in Broadway, where by a happy providence, once more, they supply extremely hard pencils. "By Jove!" cried Varden. "I remember now being told something about a cablegram when I got out, but I never connected it with Loader. I thought it was just some stupidity of the Western Electric people." "Quite so. Well, as soon as I'd got that, I popped along to Loader's with a picklock in one pocket and an automatic in the other. The good Bunter went with me, and if I didn't return by a certain time, had orders to telephone for the police. So you see, everything was pretty well covered. Bunter was the chauffeur who was waiting for you, Mr. Varden, but you turned suspicious. I don't blame you altogether. So all we could do was to forward your luggage along to the train. On the way out, we met the Loader servants en route for New York in a car, which showed us that we were on the right track, and also that I was going to have a fairly simple job of it. You've heard all about my interview with Mr. Varden. I really don't think I could improve upon his account. When I'd seen him and his traps safely off the premises, I made for the studio. It was empty, so I opened the secret door, and, as I expected, saw a line of light under the workshop door at the far end of the passage. So Loader was there all the time. Of course he was. I took my little pop gun tight in my fist and opened the door very gently. Loader was standing between the tank and the switchboard, very busy indeed, so busy he didn't hear me come in. His hands were black with graphite, a big heap of which was spread on a sheet on the floor, and he was engaged with a long, springy coil of copper wire running to the output of the transformer. The big packing case had been opened, and all the hooks were occupied. "Loader," I said. He turned on me with a face like nothing human. "Whimsy," he shouted. "What the hell are you doing here?" "I have come," I said, "to tell you that I know how the apple gets into the dumpling," and I showed him the automatic. He gave a great yell and dashed at the switchboard, turning out the light so that I could not see to aim. I heard him leap at me, and then there came in the darkness a crash and a splash, and a shriek such as I never heard, not in 5 years of war, and never want to hear again. I groped forward for the switchboard. Of course, I turned on everything before I could lay my hand on the light, but I got it at last, a great white glare from the floodlight over the vat. He lay there, still twitching faintly. Cyanide, you see, is about the swiftest and painfulest thing out. Before I could move to do anything, I knew he was dead poisoned and drowned and dead. The coil of wire that had tripped him had gone into the vat with him. Without thinking, I touched it, and got a shock that pretty well staggered me. Then I realized that I must have turned on the current when I was hunting for the light. I looked into the vat again. As he fell, his dying hands had clutched at the wire. The coils were tight round his fingers, and the current was methodically depositing a film of copper all over his hands, which were blackened with the graphite. I had just sense enough to realize that Loader was dead, and that it might be a nasty sort of lookout for me if the thing came out, for I'd certainly gone along to threaten him with a pistol. I searched about till I found some solder and an iron. Then I went upstairs and called in Bunter, who had done his 10 miles in record time. We went into the smoking room and soldered the arm of that cursed figure into place again, as well as we could, and then we took everything back into the workshop. We cleaned off every fingerprint and removed every trace of our presence. We left the light and the switchboard as they were, and returned to New York by an extremely roundabout route. The only thing we brought away with us was the facsimile of the consular seal, and that we threw into the river. Loder was found by the butler next morning. We read in the papers how he had fallen into the vat when engaged on some experiments in electroplating. The ghastly fact was commented upon that the dead man's hands were thickly coppered over. They couldn't get it off without irreverent violence, so he was buried like that. That's all. Please, Armstrong, may I have my whiskey and soda now? What happened to the couch? Inquired Smith Hartington presently. I bought it in at the sale of Loder's things, said Wimsey, and got hold of a dear old Catholic priest I knew, to whom I told the whole story under strict vow of secrecy. He was a very sensible and feeling old bird, so one moonlight night Bunter and I carried the thing out in the car to his own little church, some miles out of the city, and gave it Christian burial in a corner of the graveyard. It seemed the best thing to do. Chapter 2. The entertaining episode of the article in question. The unprofessional detective career of Lord Peter Wimsey was regulated, though the word has no particular propriety in this connection, by a persistent and undignified inquisitiveness, the habit of asking silly questions natural, though irritating, in the immature male remained with him long after his immaculate man, Bunter, had become attached to his service to shave the bristles from his chin and see to the due purchase and housing of Napoleon brandies and Villar cigars. At the age of 32, his sister Mary christened him Elephant's Child. It was his idiotic inquiries, before his brother, the Duke of Denver, who grew scarlet with mortification as to what the woolsack was really stuffed with, that led the then Lord Chancellor idly to investigate the article in question, and to discover, tucked deep within its recesses, that famous diamond necklace of the Marchioness of Writtle, which had disappeared on the day Parliament was opened and been safely secreted by one of the cleaners. It was by a continual and personal badgering of the chief engineer at Toulouse on the question of why is oscillation and how is it done, that his lordship incidentally unmasked the great Plofsky gang of anarchist conspirators, who were accustomed to converse in code by a methodical system of howls, superimposed to the great annoyance of listeners in British and European stations upon the London wavelength, and duly relayed by 5 tick hex over a radius of some 500 or 600 miles. He annoyed persons of more leisure than decorum by suddenly taking into his head to descend to the underground by way of the stairs, though the only exciting things he ever actually found there were the blood-stained boots of the Sloane Square murderer. On the other hand, when the drains were taken up at Glegg's Folly, it was by hanging about and hindering the plumbers at their job that he accidentally made the discovery which hanged that detestable poisoner. William Girdlestone Chitty. Accordingly, it was with no surprise at all that the reliable Bunter, one April morning, received the announcement of an abrupt change of plan. They had arrived at the Gare Saint-Lazare in good time to register the luggage. Their 3-month trip to Italy had been purely for enjoyment, and had been followed by a pleasant fortnight in Paris. They were now intending to pay a short visit to the Duc de Sainte-Croix in Rouen, on their way back to England. Lord Peter paced the Salle des Pas Perdus for some time, buying an illustrated paper or two and eyeing the crowd. He bent an appreciative eye on a slim, shingled creature with the face of a Paris gamine, but was forced to admit to himself that her ankles were a trifle on the thick side. He assisted an elderly lady who was explaining to the bookstall clerk that she wanted a map of Paris and not a carte postale, consumed a quick cognac at one of the little green tables at the far end, and then decided he had better go down and see how Bunter was getting on. In half an hour, Bunter and his porter had worked themselves up to the second place in the enormous queue, for, as usual, one of the weighing machines was out of order. In front of them stood an agitated little group, the young woman Lord Peter had noticed in the Salle des Pas Perdus, a sallow-faced man of about 30, their porter, and the registration official, who was peering eagerly through his little guichet. "Mais je te répète que je ne les ai pas," said the sallow man heatedly. Voyons, voyons. C'est bien toi qui les as pris, n'est-ce pas? Eh bien alors, comment veux-tu que je les ai? Moi, mais non, je te les ai bien donnés là-haut, avant d'aller chercher les journaux. Je t'assure que non. Enfin, c'est évident, j'aille chercher partout. Que diable, tu ne m'as rien donné. Du tout, du tout. Mais puisque je t'ai dit d'aller faire enregistrer les bagages, ne faut-il pas que je t'ai bien remis les billets? Me prends-tu pour un imbécile, va? On n'est pas dépourvu de sens, mais regarde l'heure, le train part à 11 heures. 20 minutes. Cherche un peu, au moins, mais puisque j'aille chercher partout le gilet, rien ne jaquet, rien ne par-dessus, rien. C'est toi! Here the porter, urged by the frantic cries and stamping of the queue, and the repeated insults of Lord Peter's porter, flung himself into the discussion. Peut-être que monsieur a bouté les billets dans son pantalon, he suggested. Triple idiot, snapped the traveller. Je vous demande, est-ce qu'on n'a jamais entendu parler de mettre des billets dans son pantalon? Jamais. The French porter is a republican, and, moreover, extremely ill-paid. The large tolerance of his English colleague is not for him. Ah, said he, dropping 2 heavy bags and looking round for moral support. Vous dites? En voilà du joli. Allons, mon petit. Ce n'est pas parce qu'on porte un faux col qu'on a le droit d'insulter les gens. The discussion might have become a full-blown row, had not the young man suddenly discovered the missing tickets. Incidentally, they were in his trousers pocket after all, and continued the registration of his luggage, to the undisguised satisfaction of the crowd. Bunter, said his lordship, who had turned his back on the group and was lighting a cigarette, I am going to change the tickets. We shall go straight on to London. Have you got that snapshot affair of yours with you? Yes, my lord, the one you can work from your pocket without anyone noticing. Yes, my lord. Get me a picture of those 2. Yes, my lord. I will see to the luggage. Wire to the Duke that I am unexpectedly called home. Very good, my lord. Lord Peter did not allude to the matter again till Bunter was putting his trousers in the press in their cabin on board the Normannia. Beyond ascertaining that the young man and woman who had aroused his curiosity were on the boat as second-class passengers, he had sedulously avoided contact with them. Did you get that photograph? I hope so, my lord. As your lordship knows, the aim from the breast pocket tends to be unreliable. I have made 3 attempts, and trust that one at least may prove to be not unsuccessful. How soon can you develop them? At once, if your lordship pleases. I have all the materials in my suitcase. What fun, said Lord Peter, eagerly tying himself into a pair of mauve silk pyjamas. May I hold the bottles and things? Mr. Bunter poured 3 ounces of water into an 8-ounce measure, and handed his master a glass rod and a minute packet. If your lordship would be so good as to stir the contents of the white packet slowly into the water, he said, bolting the door, and when dissolved, add the contents of the blue packet, just like a Seidlitz powder, said his lordship happily. Does it fizz? Not much, my lord, replied the expert, shaking a quantity of hypo-crystals into the hand-basin. That's a pity, said Lord Peter. I say, Bunter, it's no end of a bore to dissolve. Yes, my lord, returned Bunter sedately. I have always found that part of the process exceptionally tedious, my lord. Lord Peter jabbed viciously with the glass rod. Just you wait, he said, in a vindictive tone, till we get to Waterloo. 3 days later, Lord Peter Wimsey sat in his book-lined sitting-room at 110 Piccadilly. The tall bunches of daffodils on the table smiled in the spring sunshine and nodded to the breeze which danced in from the open window. The door opened, and his lordship glanced up from a handsome edition of the Comtesse de la Fontaine, whose handsome hand-coloured Fragonard plates he was examining with the aid of a lens. Morning, Bunter. Anything doing? I have ascertained, my lord, that the young person in question has entered the service of the elder Duchess of Medway. Her name is Celestine Burger. You are less accurate than usual, Bunter. Nobody off the stage is called Celestine. You should say, under the name of Celestine Berger. And the man? He's domiciled at this address in Guildford Street, Bloomsbury, my lord. Excellent, my Bunter. Now give me who's who. Was it a very tiresome job? Not exceptionally so, my lord. One of these days I suppose I shall give you something to do which you will jib at, said his lordship, and you will leave me, and I shall cut my throat. Thanks. Run away and play. I shall lunch at the club. The book which Bunter had handed his employer indeed bore the words Who's Who engrossed upon its cover, but it was to be found in no public library and in no bookseller's shop. It was a bulky manuscript, closely filled, in part with a small print-like handwriting of Mr. Bunter, in part with Lord Peter's neat and altogether illegible hand. It contained biographies of the most unexpected people and the most unexpected facts about the most obvious people. Lord Peter turned to a very long entry under the name of the Dowager Duchess of Medway. It appeared to make satisfactory reading, for after a time he smiled, closed the book, and went to the telephone. Yes, this is the Duchess of Medway. Who is it? The deep, harsh old voice pleased Lord Peter. He could see the imperious face and upright figure of what had been the most famous beauty in the London of the 60s. It's Peter Wimsey, Duchess. Indeed, and how do you do, young man? Back from your continental jaunting? Just home and longing to lay my devotion at the feet of the most fascinating lady in England. God bless my soul, child. What do you want? Demanded the Duchess. Boys like you don't flatter an old woman for nothing. I want to tell you my sins, Duchess. You should have lived in the great days, said the voice appreciatively. Your talents are wasted on the young fry. That is why I want to talk to you, Duchess. Well, my dear, if you've committed any sins worth hearing, I shall enjoy your visit. You are as exquisite in kindness as in charm. I am coming this afternoon. I will be at home to you and to no one else. There. Dear lady, I kiss your hands, said Lord Peter, and he heard a deep chuckle as the Duchess rang off. You may say what you like, Duchess, said Lord Peter from his reverential position on the fender stool, but you are the youngest grandmother in London, not excepting my own mother. Dear Honoria is the merest child, said the Duchess. I have 20 years more experience of life, and have arrived at the age when we boast of them. I have every intention of being a great-grandmother before I die. Sylvia is being married in a fortnight's time to that stupid son of Attenbury's. Abcock? Yes. He keeps the worst hunters I ever saw, and doesn't know still champagne from Sauterne. But Sylvia is stupid too, poor child, so I dare say they will get on charmingly. In my day one had to have either brains or beauty to get on, preferably both. Nowadays nothing seems to be required but a total lack of figure. But all the sense went out of society with the House of Lords veto. I accept you, Peter. You have talents. It is a pity you do not employ them in politics. Dear lady, God forbid. Perhaps you are right, as things are. There were giants in my day. Dear Dizzy, I remember so well when his wife died. How hard we all tried to get him. Medway had died the year before, but he was wrapped up in that stupid Bradford woman, who had never even read a line of one of his books, and couldn't have understood him if she had. And now we have Abcock standing for Midhurst, and married to Sylvia. You haven't invited me to the wedding, Duchess dear. I'm so hurt, sighed his lordship. Bless you, child. I didn't send out the invitations, but I suppose your brother and that tiresome wife of his will be there. You must come, of course, if you want to. I had no idea you had a passion for weddings. Hadn't you? Said Peter. I have a passion for this one. I want to see Lady Sylvia wearing white satin and the family lace and diamonds, and to sentimentalize over the days when my fox terrier bit the stuffing out of her doll. Very well, my dear, you shall. Come early and give me your support. As for the diamonds, If it weren't a family tradition, Sylvia shouldn't wear them. She has the impudence to complain of them. I thought they were some of the finest in existence. So they are, but she says the settings are ugly and old-fashioned, and she doesn't like diamonds, and they won't go with her dress. Such nonsense. Whoever heard of a girl not liking diamonds? She wants to be something romantic and moonshiny in pearls. I have no patience with her. I'll promise to admire them, said Peter. Use the privilege of early acquaintance and tell her she's an ass and so on. I'd love to have a view of them. When do they come out of cold storage? Mr. Whitehead will bring them up from the bank the night before, said the Duchess, and they'll go into the safe in my room. Come round at 12 o'clock, and you shall have a private view of them. That would be delightful. Mind they don't disappear in the night, won't you? Oh, my dear, the house is going to be overrun with policemen. Such a nuisance. I suppose it can't be helped. Oh, I think it's a good thing, said Peter. I have rather an unwholesome weakness for policemen. On the morning of the wedding day, Lord Peter emerged from Bunter's hands a marvel of sleek brilliance. His primrose-coloured hair was so exquisite a work of art that to eclipse it with his glossy hat was like shutting up the sun in a shrine of polished jet. His spats, light trousers, and exquisitely polished shoes formed a tone symphony in monochrome. It was only by the most impassioned pleading that he persuaded his tyrant to allow him to place 2 small photographs and a thin foreign letter in his breast pocket. Mr. Bunter, likewise immaculately attired, stepped into the taxi after him. At noon precisely they were deposited beneath the striped awning which adorned the door of the Duchess of Medway's house in Park Lane. Bunter promptly disappeared in the direction of the back entrance, while his lordship mounted the steps and asked to see the Dowager. The majority of the guests had not yet arrived, but the house was full of agitated people, flitting hither and thither, with flowers and prayer books, while a clatter of dishes and cutlery from the dining-room proclaimed the laying of a sumptuous breakfast. Lord Peter was shown into the morning-room while the footman went to announce him, and here he found a very close friend and devoted colleague, Detective Inspector Parker, mounting guard in plain clothes over a costly collection of white elephants. Lord Peter greeted him with an affectionate hand-grip. "All serene so far?" he inquired. "Perfectly okay. You got my note?" "Sure thing. I've got 3 of our men shadowing your friend in Guildford Street. The girl is very much in evidence here. Does the old lady's wig and that sort of thing. Bit of a coming-on disposition, isn't she?" "You surprise me," said Lord Peter. "No," as his friend grinned sardonically. "You really do. Not seriously? That would throw all my calculations out." "Oh, no. Saucy with her eyes and her tongue, that's all. Do her job well. I've heard no complaints. What put you on to this?" "Pure accident. Of course I may be quite mistaken." "Did you receive any information from Paris?" "I wish you wouldn't use that phrase," said Lord Peter peevishly. "It's so of the yard-yardy. One of these days it'll give you away." "Sorry," said Parker. "Second nature, I suppose." "Those are the things to beware of," returned his lordship, with an earnestness that seemed a little out of place. "One can keep guard on everything but just those second-nature tricks." He moved across to the window, which overlooked the tradesman's entrance. "Hello," he said. "Here's our bird." Parker joined him and saw the neat, shingled head of the French girl from the Gare Saint-Lazare, topped by a neat black bandeau and bow. A man with a basket full of white narcissi had rung the bell, and appeared to be trying to make a sale. Parker gently opened the window, and they heard Celestine say with a marked French accent, "No, nothing today, thank you." The man insisted in the monotonous whine of his type, thrusting a big bunch of the white flowers upon her, but she pushed them back into the basket with an angry exclamation and flirted away, tossing her head and slapping the door smartly to. The man moved off, muttering. As he did so, a thin, unhealthy-looking lounger in a check cap detached himself from a lamp-post opposite and mouched along the street after him, at the same time casting a glance up at the window. Mr. Parker looked at Lord Peter, nodded, and made a slight sign with his hand. At once the man in the check cap removed his cigarette from his mouth, extinguished it, and tucking the stub behind his ear, moved off without a second glance. "Very interesting," said Lord Peter, when both were out of sight. "Hark!" There was a sound of running feet overhead, a cry, and a general commotion. The two men dashed to the door as the bride, rushing frantically downstairs with her bevy of bridesmaids after her, proclaimed in a hysterical shriek, "The diamonds! They're stolen! They're gone!" Instantly the house was in an uproar. The servants and the caterer's men crowded into the hall. The bride's father burst out from his room in a magnificent white waistcoat and no coat. The Duchess of Medway descended upon Mr. Parker, demanding that something should be done, while the butler, who never to the day of his death got over the disgrace, ran out of the pantry with a corkscrew in one hand and a priceless bottle of crusted port in the other, which he shook with all the vehemence of a town crier ringing a bell. The only dignified entry was made by the Dowager Duchess, who came down like a ship in sail, dragging Celestine with her, and admonishing her not to be so silly. "Be quiet, girl," said the Dowager. "Anyone would think you were going to be murdered." "Allow me, Your Grace," said Mr. Bunter, appearing suddenly from nowhere in his usual unperturbed manner, and taking the agitated Celestine firmly by the arm. "Young woman, calm yourself. But what is to be?" cried the bride's mother. "How did it happen?" It was at this moment that Detective Inspector Parker took the floor. It was the most impressive and dramatic moment in his whole career. His magnificent calm rebuked the clamorous nobility surrounding him. "Your Grace," he said, "there is no cause for alarm. Our measures have been taken. We have the criminals and the gems, thanks to Lord Peter Wimsey, from whom we received Charles," said Lord Peter in an awful voice, "warning of the attempt. One of our men is just bringing in the male criminal at the front door, taken red-handed with Your Grace's diamonds in his possession." All gazed round, and perceived indeed the check-capped lounger and a uniformed constable entering with the flower seller between them. "The female criminal who picked the lock of Your Grace's safe is here. No, you don't," he added, as Celestine, amid a torrent of Apache language, which nobody, fortunately, had French enough to understand, attempted to whip out a revolver from the bosom of her demure black dress. "Celestine Berger," he continued, pocketing the weapon, "I arrest you in the name of the law, and I warn you that anything you say will be taken down and used as evidence against you." "Heaven help us," said Lord Peter. "The roof would fly off the court, and you've got the name wrong, Charles. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to introduce to you Jacques Larouge, known as Sans Culotte, the youngest and cleverest thief, safe-breaker, and female impersonator that ever occupied a dossier in the Palais de Justice." There was a gasp. Jacques Sans Culotte gave vent to a low oath and cocked a gamin grimace at Peter. "C'est parfait," said he. "Toutes mes félicitations, my lord. What you call a fair cop, hein? And now I know him," he added, grinning at Bunter, "the so-patient Englishman who stand behind us in the queue at St. Lazare. But tell me, please, how you know me, that I may correct it next time." "I have mentioned to you before, Charles," said Lord Peter, "the unwisdom of falling into habits of speech. They give you away. Now, in France, every male child is brought up to use masculine adjectives about himself. He says, 'Que je suis beau,' but a little girl has it rammed home to her that she is female. She must say, 'Que je suis belle.' It must make it beastly hard to be a female impersonator. When I am at a station and I hear an excited young woman say to her companion, 'Me prends-tu pour un imbécile?' the masculine article arouses curiosity. And that's that," he concluded briskly. The rest was merely a matter of getting Bunter to take a photograph and communicating with our friends of the Charité and Scotland Yard. Jacques Sans-Culotte bowed again. "Once more I congratulate my lord. He is the only Englishman I have ever met who is capable of appreciating our beautiful language. I will pay great attention in future to the article in question." With an awful look, the Dowager Duchess of Medway advanced upon Lord Peter. "Peter," she said, "do you mean to say you knew about this, and that for the last 3 weeks you have allowed me to be dressed and undressed and put to bed by a young man?" His lordship had the grace to blush. "Duchess," he said humbly, "on my honour I didn't know absolutely for certain till this morning, and the police were so anxious to have these people caught red-handed. What can I do to show my penitence? Shall I cut the privileged beast in pieces?" The grim old mouth relaxed a little. "After all," said the Dowager Duchess, with the delightful consciousness that she was going to shock her daughter-in-law, "there are very few women of my age who could make the same boast. It seems that we die as we have lived, my dear." For indeed the Dowager Duchess of Medway had been notable in her day. Chapter 3. The Fascinating Problem of Uncle Meleager's Will. "You look a little worried, Bunter," said his lordship kindly to his manservant. "Is there anything I can do?" The valet's face brightened as he released his employer's grey trousers from the press. "Perhaps your lordship could be so good as to think," he said hopefully, "of a word in 7 letters with S in the middle." "Meaning 2. Also," suggested Lord Peter thoughtlessly. "I beg your lordship's pardon. TWO and 7 letters. Nonsense," said Lord Peter. "How about that bath?" "It should be just about ready, my lord." Lord Peter Wimsey swung his mauve silk legs lightly over the edge of the bed and stretched appreciatively. It was a beautiful June that year. Through the open door he saw the delicate coils of steam wreathing across a shaft of yellow sunlight. Every step he took into the bathroom was a conscious act of enjoyment. In a husky light tenor, he caroled a few bars of "Maman, dites-moi." Then a thought struck him, and he turned back. "Bunter." "My lord?" "No bacon this morning. Quite the wrong smell. I was thinking of buttered eggs, my lord." "Excellent. Like primroses. The Beaconsfield touch," said his lordship approvingly. His song died into a rapturous crooning as he settled into the verbena-scented water. His eyes roamed vaguely over the pale blue and white tiles of the bathroom walls. Mr. Bunter had retired to the kitchen to put the coffee on the stove when the bell rang. Surprised, he hastened back to the bedroom. It was empty. With increased surprise, he realized that it must have been the bathroom bell. The words "heart attack" formed swiftly in his mind, to be displaced by the still more alarming thought, "no soap." He opened the door almost nervously. "Did you ring, my lord?" he demanded of Lord Peter's head alone visible. "Yes," said his lordship abruptly. "Amsash." "I beg your lordship's pardon. Amsashi. Word of 7 letters, meaning 2, with S in the middle. 2 aces. Amsashi." Bunter's expression became beatified. "Undoubtedly correct," he said, pulling a small sheet of paper from his pocket and entering the word upon it in pencil. "I am extremely obliged to your lordship. In that case, the indifferent cook in 6 letters ending with red must be Alfred." Lord Peter waved a dismissive hand. On re-entering his bedroom, Lord Peter was astonished to see his sister Mary seated in his own particular chair and consuming his buttered eggs. He greeted her with a friendly acerbity, demanding why she should look him up at that unearthly hour. "I'm riding with Freddie Arbuthnot," said her ladyship, "as you might see by my legs, if you were really as big a Sherlock as you make out." "Riding," replied her brother. "I had already deduced, though I admit that Freddie's name was not writ large to my before-breakfast eye upon the knees of your breeches. But why this visit?" "Well, because you were on the way," said Lady Mary, "and I'm booked up all day, and I want you to come and dine at the Soviet Club with me tonight." Good God, Mary, why? You know I hate the place. Cooking's beastly, the men don't shave, and the conversation gets my goat. Besides, last time I went there, your friend Goyles plugged me in the shoulder. I thought you'd chucked the Soviet Club. It isn't me. It's Hannah Marryat. What, the intense young woman with the badly bobbed hair and the brogues? Well, she's never been able to afford a good hairdresser. That's just what I want your help about. My dear child, I can't cut her hair for her. Bunter might. He can do most things. Silly, no. But she's got, that is, she used to have, an uncle, the very rich curmudgeon-y sort, you know, who never gave anyone a penny. Well, he's dead, and they can't find his will. Perhaps he didn't make one. Oh, yes, he did. He wrote and told her so, but the nasty old thing hid it, and it can't be found. Is the will in her favor? Yes. Who's the next of kin? She and her mother are the only members of the family left. Well then, she's only got to sit tight and she'll get the goods. No, because the horrid old man left 2 wills, and if she can't find the latest one, they'll prove the first one. He explained that to her carefully. Oh, I see. By the way, I thought the young woman was a socialist. Oh, she is. Terrifically so. One really can't help admiring her. She's done some wonderful work. Yes, I dare say. But in that case, I don't see why she need be so keen on getting Uncle's dollars. Mary began to chuckle. Ah, but that's where Uncle Melliger. Uncle Melliger, that's his name. Melliger Finch. Oh. Yes, well, that's where he's been so clever. Unless she finds the new will, the old will comes into force and hands over every penny of the money to the funds of the Primrose League. Lord Peter gave a little yelp of joy. Good for Uncle Melliger. But look here, Polly, I'm a Tory if anything. I'm certainly not a Red. Why should I help to snatch the good gold from the Primrose Leaguers and hand it over to the Third International? Uncle Melliger's a sport. I take to Uncle Melliger. Oh, but Peter, I really don't think she'll do that with it. Not at present, anyway. They're awfully poor, and her mother ought to have some frightfully difficult operation or something, and go and live abroad, so it really is ever so important they should get the money. And perhaps Hannah wouldn't be quite so red if she'd ever had a bean of her own. Besides, you could make it a condition of helping her that she should go and get properly shingled at Bresl's. You are a very cynically minded person, said his lordship. However, it would be fun to have a go at Uncle M. Was he obliging enough to give any clues for finding the will? He wrote a funny sort of letter, which we can't make head or tail of. Come to the club tonight and she'll show it to you. Right-ho. 7 o'clock do, and we could go on and see a show afterwards. Do you mind clearing out now? I'm going to get dressed. Amid a deafening babble of voices in a low-pitched cellar, the Soviet Club meets and dines. Ethics and sociology, the latest vortices of the whirligig school of verse, combine with the smoke of countless cigarettes to produce an inspissated atmosphere, through which flat, angular mural paintings dimly lower upon the revellers. There is painfully little room for the elbows, or indeed for any part of one's body. Lord Peter, his feet curled under his chair to avoid the stray kicks of the heavy brogues opposite him, was acutely conscious of an unbecoming attitude and an overheated feeling about the head. He found it difficult to get any response from Hannah Marryat. Under her heavy, ill-cut fringe, her dark eyes gloomed sombrely at him. At the same time, he received a strong impression of something enormously vital. He had a sudden fancy that if she were set free from self-defensiveness and the importance of being earnest, she would exhibit unexpected powers of enjoyment. He was interested, but oppressed. Mary, to his great relief, suggested that they should have their coffee upstairs. They found a quiet corner with comfortable chairs. Well now, said Mary encouragingly. Of course you understand, said Miss Marryat mournfully, that if it were not for the monstrous injustice of Uncle Melliger's other will, and Mother being so ill, I shouldn't take any steps. But when there is £250,000 and the prospect of doing real good with it, naturally, said Lord Peter, it isn't the money you care about. As the dear old bromide says, it's the principle of the thing. Right you are. Now supposing we have a look at Uncle Meleager's letter. Miss Marriott rummaged in a very large handbag and passed the paper over. This was Uncle Meleager's letter, dated from Siena 12 months previously. My dear Hannah, when I die, which I propose to do at my own convenience and not at that of my family, you will at last discover my monetary worth. It is, of course, considerably less than you had hoped, and quite fails, I assure you, adequately to represent my actual worth in the eyes of the discerning. I made my will yesterday, leaving the entire sum, such as it is, to the Primrose League, a body quite as fatuous as any other in our preposterous state, but which has the advantage of being peculiarly obnoxious to yourself. This will be found in the safe in the library. I am not, however, unmindful of the fact that your mother is my sister, and you and she my only surviving relatives. I shall accordingly amuse myself by drawing up today a second will, superseding the other, and leaving the money to you. I have always held that woman is a frivolous animal. A woman who pretends to be serious is wasting her time and spoiling her appearance. I consider that you have wasted your time to a really shocking extent. Accordingly, I intend to conceal this will, and that in such a manner that you will certainly never find it, unless by the exercise of a sustained frivolity. I hope you will contrive to be frivolous enough to become the heiress of your affectionate Uncle Meleager. Couldn't we use that letter as proof of the testator's intention and fight the will? Asked Mary anxiously. Afraid not, said Lord Peter. You see, there's no evidence here that the will was ever actually drawn up, though I suppose we could find the witnesses. We've tried, said Miss Marriott, but as you see, Uncle Meleager was travelling abroad at the time, and he probably got some obscure people in some obscure Italian town to witness it for him. We advertised, but got no answer. Uncle Meleager doesn't seem to have left things to chance, and anyhow, wills are queer things, and so are the probate and divorce wallahs. Obviously the thing to do is to find the other will. Did the clues he speaks of turn up among his papers? We hunted through everything, and of course we had the whole house searched from top to bottom for the will, but it was quite useless. You've not destroyed anything, of course. Who were the executors of the Primrose League will? Mother and Mr. Sands, Uncle Meleager's solicitor. The will left Mother a silver teapot for her trouble. I like Uncle Meleager more and more. Anyhow, he did the sporting thing. I'm beginning to enjoy this case like anything. Where did Uncle Meleager hang out? It's an old house down at Dorking. It's rather quaint. Somebody had a fancy to build a little Roman villa sort of thing there, with a veranda behind, with columns and a pond in the front hall, and statues. It's very decent there just now, though it's awfully cold in the winter, with all those stone floors and stone stairs and the skylight over the hall. Mother said perhaps you would be very kind and come down and have a look at it. I'd simply love to. Can we start tomorrow? I promise you we'll be frivolous enough to please even Uncle Meleager, if you'll do your bit, Miss Marriott. Won't we, Mary? Rather. And I say, hadn't we better be moving if we're going to the Palumbra? I never go to music halls, said Miss Marriott ungraciously. Oh, but you must come tonight, said his lordship persuasively. It's so frivolous. Just think how it would please Uncle Meleager. Accordingly, the next day found the party, including the indispensable Mr. Bunter, assembled at Uncle Meleager's house. Pending the settlement of the will question, there had seemed every reason why Mr. Finch's executrix and next of kin should live in the house, thus providing every facility for what Lord Peter called the treasure hunt. After being introduced to Mrs. Marriott, who was an invalid and remained in her room, Lady Mary and her brother were shown over the house by Miss Marriott, who explained to them how carefully the search had been conducted. Every paper had been examined, every book in the library scrutinized page by page, the walls and chimneys tapped for hiding places, the boards taken up, and so forth, but with no result. "You know," said his lordship, "I'm sure you've been going the wrong way to work. My idea is old Uncle Melliger was a man of his word. If he said frivolous, he meant really frivolous. Something beastly silly. I wonder what it was." He was still wondering when he went up to dress. Bunter was putting studs in his shirt. Lord Peter gazed thoughtfully at him and then inquired, "Are any of Mr. Finch's old staff still here?" "Yes, my lord. The cook and the housekeeper. Wonderful old gentleman they say he was too. 83, but as up-to-date as you please, had his wireless in his bedroom, and enjoyed the Savoy bands every night of his life. Followed his politics, and was always ready with the details of the latest big law cases. If a young lady came to see him, he'd like to see she had her hair shingled, and the latest style in fashions. They say he took up crosswords as soon as they came in, and was remarkably quick at solving them, my lord, and inventing them. Took a £10 prize in the Daily Yell for one, and was wonderfully pleased to get it, they say. My lord, rich as he was, indeed." "Yes, my lord. He was a great man for acrostics before that, I understood them to say, but when crosswords came in, he threw away his acrostics and said he liked the new game better. Wonderfully adaptable, if I may say so. He seems to have been for an old gentleman." "Was he, by Jove?" said his lordship absently, and then with sudden energy. "Bunter, I'd like to double your salary, but I suppose you'd take it as an insult." The conversation bore fruit at dinner. "What," inquired his lordship, "happened to Uncle Melliger's crosswords?" "Crosswords," said Hannah Marriott, knitting her heavy brows. "Oh, those puzzle things. Poor old man, he went mad over them. He had every newspaper sent him, and in his last illness he'd be trying to fill the wretched things in. It was worse than his acrostics and his jigsaw puzzles. Poor old creature. He must have been senile, I'm afraid. Of course we looked through them, but there wasn't anything there. We put them all in the attic." "The attic for me," said Lord Peter. "And for me," said Mary. "I don't believe there was anything senile about Uncle Melliger." The evening was warm, and they had dined in the little viridarium at the back of the house, with its tall vases and hanging baskets of flowers and little marble statues. "Is there an attic here?" said Peter. "It seems such an un-attic thing to have in a house like this." "It's just a horrid, poky little hole over the porch," said Miss Marriott, rising and leading the way. "Don't tumble into the pond, will you? It's a great nuisance having it there, especially at night. I always tell them to leave a light on." Lord Peter glanced into the miniature impluvium, with its tiling of red, white, and black marble. "That's not a very classic design," he observed. "No. Uncle Melliger used to complain about it and say he must have it altered. There was a proper one once, I believe, but it got damaged, and the man before Uncle Melliger had it replaced by some local idiot. He built 3 bay windows out of the dining room at the same time, which made it very much lighter and pleasanter, of course, but it looks awful. Now this tiling is all right. Uncle put that in himself." She pointed to a mosaic dog at the threshold with the motto Cave Canum, and Lord Peter recognized it as a copy of a Pompeian original. A narrow stair brought them to the attic, where the Whimsies flung themselves with enthusiasm upon a huge heap of dusty old newspapers and manuscripts. The latter seemed the likelier field, so they started with them. They consisted of a quantity of crosswords in manuscript, presumably the children of Uncle Melliger's own brain. The square, the list of definitions, and the solution were in every case neatly pinned together. Some early efforts, no doubt, were childishly simple, but others were difficult, with elusive or punning clues, some of the ordinary newspaper type, others in the form of rhymed distichs. They scrutinized the solutions closely, and searched the definitions for acrostics or hidden words, unsuccessfully for a long time. "This one's a funny one," said Mary. "Nothing seems to fit. Oh, it's two pinned together. No, it isn't. Yes, it is. It's only been pinned up wrong. Peter, have you seen the puzzle belonging to these clues anywhere?" "What one's that?" "Well, it's numbered rather funnily with Roman and Arabic numerals, and it starts off with a thing that hasn't got any numbers at all. Truth, poor girl, was nobody's daughter. She took off her clothes and jumped into the water." "Frivolous old wretch," said Miss Marriott. "Friv here, gimme that," cried Lord Peter. "Look here, I say, Miss Marriott, you oughtn't to have overlooked this. I thought it just belonged to that other square." "Not it. It's different. I believe it's our thing. Listen, your expectation to be rich here will reach its highest pitch. That's one for you, Miss Marriott. Mary, hunt about. We must find the square that belongs to this." But, though they turned everything upside down, they could find no square with Roman and Arabic numerals. "Hang it all," said Peter. "It must be made to fit one of these others. Look, I know what he's done. He's just taken a 15-letter square and numbered it with Roman figures one way and Arabic the other. I bet it fits into that one it was pinned up with." But the one it was pinned up with turned out to have only 13 squares. "Dash it all," said his lordship. "We'll have to carry the whole lot down and work away at it till we find the one it does fit." He snatched up a great bundle of newspapers and led the way out. The others followed, each with an armful. The search had taken some time, and the atrium was in semi-darkness. "Where shall I take them?" asked Lord Peter, calling back over his shoulder. "Hi!" cried Mary. "And look where you're going," cried her friend. They were too late. A splash and a flounder proclaimed that Lord Peter had walked, like Johnny head in air over the edge of the impluvium, papers and all. "You ass," said Mary. His lordship scrambled out, spluttering, and Hannah Marriott suddenly burst out into the first laugh Peter had ever heard her give. Truth, they say, was nobody's daughter. She took off her clothes and fell into the water, she proclaimed. "Well, I couldn't take my clothes off with you here, could I?" grumbled Lord Peter. "We'll have to fish out the papers. I'm afraid they've got a bit damp." Miss Marriott turned on the lights and they started to clear the basin. "Truth, poor girl," began Lord Peter, and suddenly, with a little shriek, began to dance on the marble edge of the impluvium. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Quite demented," said Mary. "How shall I break it to mother?" 13, 14, cried his lordship, and sat down suddenly and damply, exhausted by his own excitement. "Feeling better?" asked his sister acidly. "I'm well. I'm all right. Everything's all right. I love Uncle Meliger. 15 squares each way. Look at it. Look at it. The truth's in the water. Didn't he say so?" "Oh, frabjous day!" "Calu. Cali. I chortle. Mary, what became of those definitions?" "They're in your pocket, all damp," said Mary. Lord Peter snatched them out hurriedly. "It's all right. They haven't run," he said. "Oh, darling Uncle Meliger, can you drain the impluvium, Miss Marriott, and find a bit of charcoal? Then I'll get some dry clothes on, and we'll get down to it. Don't you see? There's your missing crossword square on the floor of the impluvium." It took, however, some time to get the basin emptied, and it was not till next morning that the party, armed with sticks of charcoal, squatted down in the empty impluvium to fill in Uncle Meliger's crossword on the marble tiles. Their first difficulty was to decide whether the red squares counted as stops or had to be filled in, but after a few definitions had been solved, the construction of the puzzle grew apace. The investigators grew steadily hotter and more thickly covered with charcoal, while the attentive Mr. Bunter hurried to and fro between the atrium and the library, and the dictionaries piled upon the edge of the impluvium. Here was Uncle Meliger's crossword square, Truth, poor girl, was nobody's daughter. She took off her clothes and jumped into the water. Across. Foolish or wise, yet one remains alone, twixt strength and justice on a heavenly throne. Oh, to what ears the clink of gold was sweet, the greed for treasure brought him but defeat. That's a hint to us, said Lord Peter. One drop of vinegar to 2 of oil dresses this curly head sprung from the soil. Nothing itself, it needs but little more to be that nothingness the preacher saw. Dusty though my fellows be, we are a kingly company. Have your own will, though here, I hold, the new is not a patch upon the old. Any loud cry would do as well, or so the poet's verses tell. This is the most unkindest cut of all, except your skill be mathematical. Little and hid from mortal sight, I darkly work to make all light. The need for this, like that it's cut off short, the building of a tower to humans taught. More than a mind discloses, and more than men believe, a definition by a man whom pussyfoot doth grieve. Backward observe her turn her way, the way of wisdom, wise men say, grew long ago by river's edge where grows today the common sedge, one of 3 by which, they say, you'll know the Cornishman alway. Blow upon blow, 5 more the vanquished Roman shows, and if the foot slip one, on crippled feet one goes. First 8. By this Jew's work the whole we find, in a glass clearly, darkly in the mind. Ix. Little by little see it grow till cut off short by hammer blow. Vi. 9. Watch him go, heel and toe, across the wide Karoo. U. 10. In expectation to be rich here you reach the highest pitch. 7th 10. Of this concerning nothing much, too often do we hear of such. 12. 10. O'er land and sea, passing on deadly wings, pain to the strong, to weaklings death it brings. I. 11. Requests like these, however long they be, stop just too soon for common courtesy. G. 11. Caesar, the living dead salute thee here, facing for thy delight tooth, claw, and spear. I. 12. One word had served, but he in ranting vein, lend me your ears, must mouth o'er Caesar slain. 10. 12. Helical circumvolution, adumbrate's correct solution. I. 13. One that works for Irishmen both by word and deed and pen. That's an easy one, said Miss Marryat. 4. 13. 7 out of 12 this number makes complete as the sun journeys on from seat to seat. Suv. 13. My brothers play with planets, Cicero, master of words, my master is below. I. 14. Free of her jesses let the falcon fly, with sight undimmed into the azure sky. 10th 14. And so you dine with Borgia. Let me lend you this as a precaution, my poor friend. I. 15. Friendship carried to excess got him in a horrid mess. 11th 15. Smooth and elastic and, I guess, the dearest treasure you possess. Down. 1 eye. If step by step the steps you wander through many of those in this, of these in those you'll view. Bunter, said Lord Peter, bring me a whisky and soda. If me without my head you do, then generously my head renew, or put it to my hinder end. Your cheer it shall nor mar nor mend. 1. Second quietly, quietly, twixt edge and edge, do this unto the thin end of the wedge. 10. Second, something that hath a reference to my state. Just as you like, it shall be written straight. 1/3, when all is read, then give the world its due, and never need the world read this of you. That's a comfort, said Lady Mary. It shows we're on the right lines. 4. Third, sing Nunc Dimittis and Magnificat, but look a little farther back than that. 14.3. Here in brief epitome attribute of royalty. 1. 4th low. At a glance the Spanish gypsy and her dance. 10 4th. Bring me skin and a needle or a stick. A needle does it slowly, a stick does it quick. 1 5th. It was a brazen business when King Phalaris made these for men. This king, of whom not much is known, by heaven's mercy was o'erthrown. 2 V. Bid Greek on Chimeon farewell? Nay, in this the sterner Roman stands by that which is vi. This the termination is of many minds' activities. 12 Vottefis. I mingle on Norwegian shore, with ebbing waters backward roar. 6 7. I stand, a ladder to renown, set twixt the stars and Milan town. 1/8 highest and lowliest both to me lay claim, the little hyssop and the king of fame. That makes that point about the squares clear, said Mary. I think it's even more significant, said her brother. 19th. This sensible old man refused to tread the path to Hades in a youngster's stead. 6th. Long since, at nature's call, they let it drop, thoughtlessly thoughtful for our next year's crop. 2. 10th. To smallest words great speakers greatness give. Here Rome propounded her alternative. 7 10th. We heap up many with toil and trouble, and find that the whole of our gain is a bubble. 12 Ad X. Add it among the hidden things, a fishy tale to light it brings. Lions, said a Gallic critic, are not these. Benevolent souls, they'd make your heart's blood freeze. 11.xi. An epithet for husky fellows that stand all robed in greens and yellows. 1 Tway. Hole without holes. Behold me here, my meaning should be wholly clear. Running all around, never setting foot to floor. If there isn't one in this room, there may be one next door. 1 13th. Ye gods, think also of that goddess's name, whose might 2 hours on end the mob proclaim. Con. The priest uplifts his voice on high, the choristers make their reply. When you've guessed it, with one voice you'll say it was a golden choice. 1 Twitwiteve. Shall learning die amid a war's alarms? I, at my birth, was clasped in iron arms. 10 Twitwive. At sunset see the labourer now loose all his oxen from the plough. 1 Xz. Without a miracle it cannot be. At this point, Solver, bid him pray for thee. To Romans saw these distant nights, how hard the way. The most remarkable part of the search, or so Lord Peter thought, was its effect on Miss Marryat. At first she hovered disconsolately on the margin, aching with wounded dignity, yet ashamed to dissociate herself from people who were toiling so hard and so cheerfully in her cause. I think that's so-and-so, Mary would say hopefully. And her brother would reply enthusiastically, Hold it in one, old lady. Good for you. We've got it this time, Miss Marryat, and explain it. And Hannah Marryat would say with a snort, That's just the childish kind of joke Uncle Melliger would make. Gradually, however, the fascination of seeing the squares fit together caught her, and when the first word appeared which showed that the searchers were definitely on the right track, she lay down flat on the floor and peered over Lord Peter's shoulder as he grovelled below, writing letters in charcoal, rubbing them out with his handkerchief and mopping his heated face, till the Moor of Venice had nothing on him in the matter of blackness. Once, half scornfully, half timidly, she made a suggestion. Twice she made a suggestion. The third time she had an inspiration. The next minute she was down in the melee, crawling over the tiles, flushed and excited, wiping important letters out with her knees as fast as Peter could write them in, poring over the pages of Roget, her eyes gleaming under her tumbled black fringe. Hurried meals of cold meat and tea sustained the exhausted party, and toward sunset Peter, with a shout of triumph, added the last letter to the square. They crawled out and looked at it. All the words can't be clues, said Mary. I think it must be just those 4. Yes, undoubtedly. It's quite clear. We've only got to look it up. Where's a Bible? Miss Marriott hunted it out from the pile of reference books. But that isn't the name of a Bible book, she said. It's those things they have at evening service. That's all you know, said Lord Peter. I was brought up religious, I was. It's Vulgate, that's what that is. You're quite right, of course, but, as Uncle Meliger says, we must look a little farther back than that. Here you are. Now then. But it doesn't say what chapter, so it doesn't. I mean, nor it does. And anyhow, all the chapters are too short. Damn. Oh. Here, suppose we just count right on from the beginning. 1, 2, 3, 17 in chapter 1, 18, 19. This must be it. 2 fair heads and 1 dark one peered excitedly at the small print, Bunter hovering decorously on the outskirts. Oh, my dove, that art in the clefts of the rock in the covert of the steep place. Oh, dear, said Mary, disappointed. That does sound rather hopeless. Are you sure you've counted right? It might mean Lord Peter scratched his head. This is a bit of a blow, he said. I don't like Uncle Milliger half as much as I did. Old beast. After all our work, moaned Mary. It must be right, cried Miss Marriott. Perhaps there's some kind of an anagram in it. We can't give up now. Bravo, said Lord Peter. That's the spirit. Afraid we're in for another outburst of frivolity, Miss Marriott. Well, it's been great fun, said Hannah Marriott. If you will excuse me, began the deferential voice of Bunter. I'd forgotten you, Bunter, said his lordship. Of course you can put us right, you always can. Where have we gone wrong? I was about to observe, my lord, that the words you mention do not appear to agree with my recollection of the passage in question. In my mother's Bible, my lord, it ran, I fancy, somewhat differently. Lord Peter closed the volume and looked at the back of it. Naturally, he said. You are right again, of course. This is a revised version. It's your fault, Miss Marriott. You would have a revised version. But can we imagine Uncle Meliger with one? No. Bring me Uncle Meliger's Bible. Come and look in the library, cried Miss Marriott, snatching him by the hand and running. Don't be so dreadfully calm. On the centre of the library table lay a huge and venerable Bible reverend in age and tooled leather binding. Lord Peter's hands caressed it, for a noble old book was like a song to his soul. Sobered by its beauty, they turned the yellow pages over, in the clefts of the rocks, in the secret places of the stairs. Miss Marriott, said his lordship, if your uncle's will is not concealed in the staircase, then, well, all I can say is, he's played a rotten trick on us, he concluded lamely. Shall we try the main staircase or the little one up to the porch? Oh, the main one, I think. I hope it won't mean pulling it down. No. Somebody would have noticed if Uncle Meliger had done anything drastic in that way. It's probably quite a simple hiding place. Wait a minute, let's ask the housekeeper. Mrs. Meekers was called and perfectly remembered that about 9 months previously Mr. Finch had pointed out to her a kind of a crack-like on the undersurface of the staircase, and had had a man in to fill it up. Certainly she could point out the exact place. There was the mark of the plaster, filling quite clear. Hooray! cried Lord Peter. Bunter a chisel or something. Uncle Meliger, we've got you. Miss Marriott, I think yours should be the hand to strike the blow. It's your staircase, you know, at least, if we find the will, so if any destruction has to be done, it's up to you. Breathless, they stood round, while with a few blows the new plaster flaked off, disclosing a wide crack in the stonework. Hannah Marriott flung down hammer and chisel and groped in the gap. "There's something," she gasped. "Lift me up, I can't reach." "Oh, it is. It is it." And she withdrew her hand, grasping a long sealed envelope bearing the superscription, positively the last will and testament of Meliger Finch. Miss Marriott gave a yodel of joy and flung her arms round Lord Peter's neck. Mary executed a joy dance. "I'll tell the world," she proclaimed. "Come and tell Mother," cried Miss Marriott. Mr. Bunter interposed. "Your lordship will excuse me," he said firmly, "but your lordship's face is all over charcoal." "Black but comely," said Lord Peter, "but I submit to your reproof. How clever we've all been, how topping everything is, how rich you are going to be, how late it is and how hungry I am. Yes, Bunter, I will wash my face. Is there anything else I can do for anybody while I feel in the mood?" "If your lordship would be so kind," said Mr. Bunter, producing a small paper from his pocket. "I should be grateful if you could favour me with a South African quadruped in 6 letters beginning with Q. Chapter 4. The Fantastic Horror of the Cat in the Bag. The Great North Road wound away like a flat steel-grey ribbon. Up it, with the sun and wind behind them, 2 black specks moved swiftly. To the yokel in charge of the hay wagon, they were only 2 of they dratted motorcyclists, as they barked and zoomed past him in rapid succession. A little farther on, a family man, driving delicately with a 2-seater sidecar, grinned as the sharp rattle of the OHV. Norton was succeeded by the feline shriek of an angry Scot flying squirrel. He, too, in bachelor days, had taken a side in that perennial feud. He sighed regretfully as he watched the racing machines dwindle away northwards. At that abominable and unexpected S bend across the bridge above Hatfield, the Norton man, in the pride of his heart, turned to wave a defiant hand at his pursuer. In that second, the enormous bulk of a loaded charabanc loomed down upon him from the bridgehead. He wrenched himself away from it in a fierce wobble, and the Scot, cornering melodramatically, with left and right footrests alternately skimming the tarmac, gained a few triumphant yards. The Norton leapt forward with wide-open throttle. A party of children, seized with sudden panic, rushed helter-skelter across the road. The Scot lurched through them in drunken swerves. The road was clear, and the chase settled down once more. It is not known why motorists, who sing the joys of the open road, spend so much petrol every weekend grinding their way to Southend and Brighton and Margate. In the stench of each other's exhausts, one hand on the horn and one foot on the brake, their eyes starting from their orbits in the nerve-wracking search for cops, corners, blind turnings and crossroads suicides. They ride in a baffled fury, hating each other. They arrive with shattered nerves and fight for parking places. They return, blinded by the headlights of fresh arrivals, whom they hate even worse than they hate each other. And all the time, the Great North Road winds away like a long, flat, steel-grey ribbon of surface, like a racetrack, without traps, without hedges, without side roads, and without traffic. True, it leads to nowhere in particular, but after all, one pub is very much like another. The tarmac reeled away, mile after mile. The sharp turn to the right at Baldock, the involute intricacies of Biggleswade, with its multiplication of signposts, gave temporary check, but brought the pursuer no nearer. Through Tempsford at full speed, with bellowing horn and exhaust, then screaming like a hurricane past the RAC post where the road forks in from Bedford. The Norton rider again glanced back. The Scot rider again sounded his horn ferociously. Flat as a chessboard, dyke and field revolved about the horizon. The constable at Eton-so-Con was by no means an anti-motor fiend. In fact, he had just alighted from his push-bike to pass the time of day with the AA man on point duty at the crossroads. But he was just and God-fearing. The sight of 2 maniacs careering at 70 miles an hour into his protectorate was more than he could be expected to countenance, the more that the local magistrate happened to be passing at that very moment in a pony trap. He advanced to the middle of the road, spreading his arms in a majestic manner. The Norton rider looked, saw the road beyond complicated by the pony trap and a traction engine, and resigned himself to the inevitable. He flung the throttle lever back, stamped on his squealing brakes, and skidded to a standstill. The Scot, having had notice, came up mincingly, with a voice like a pleased kitten. "Now then," said the constable in a tone of reproof, "ain't you got no more sense than to come driving into the town at 100 mile an hour? This ain't Brooklands, you know. I never see anything like it. I have to take your names and numbers, if you please. You'll bear witness, Mr. Nadgett, as they was doing over 80. The AA man, after a swift glance over the 2 sets of handlebars to assure himself that the black sheep were not of his flock, said, with an air of impartial accuracy, "About 66.5, I should say, if you was to ask me in court." "Look here, you blighter," said the Scot man indignantly to the Norton man. "Why the hell couldn't you stop when you heard me hoot? I've been chasing you with your beastly bag nearly 30 miles. Why can't you look after your own rotten luggage?" He indicated a small, stout bag, tied with string to his own carrier. "That?" said the Norton man with scorn. "What do you mean? It's not mine. Never saw it in my life." This barefaced denial threatened to render the Scot rider speechless. "Of all the—" he gasped. "Why, you crimson idiot, I saw it fall off just the other side of Hatfield." I yelled and blew like fury. "I suppose that overhead gear of yours makes so much noise you can't hear anything else. I take the trouble to pick the thing up and go after you, and all you do is to race off like a lunatic and run me into a cop. Fat lot of thanks one gets for trying to be decent to fools on the road." "That ain't neither here nor there," said the policeman. "Your license, please, sir." "Here you are," said the Scot man, ferociously flapping out his pocketbook. "My name's Walters, and it's the last time I'll try to do anybody a good turn. You can lay your shirt." "Walters," said the constable, entering the particulars laboriously in his notebook. "And Simpkins, you'll have your summonses in due course. It'll be for about a week. Hence, on Monday or thereabouts, I shouldn't wonder." "Another 40 bob gone west," growled Mr. Simpkins, toying with his throttle. "Oh, well, can't be helped, I suppose." "40 bob," snorted the constable. "What do you think? Furious driving to the common danger, that's what it is. You'll be lucky to get off with 5 quid apiece." "Oh, blast," said the other, stamping furiously on the kick-starter. The engine roared into life, but Mr. Walters dexterously swung his machine across the Norton's path. "Oh, no, you don't," he said viciously. "You jolly well take your bleeding bag, and no nonsense. I tell you, I saw it fall off." "Now, no language," began the constable, when he suddenly became aware that the AA man was staring in a very odd manner at the bag and making signs to him. "Hullo," he demanded. "What's the matter with the bleeding bag, did you say? Here, I'd like to have a look at that 'ere bag, sir, if you don't mind." "It's nothing to do with me," said Mr. Walters, handing it over. "I saw it fall off and—" His voice died away in his throat, and his eyes became fixed upon one corner of the bag, where something damp and horrible was seeping darkly through. "Did you notice this 'ere corner when you picked it up?" asked the constable. He prodded it gingerly and looked at his fingers. "I don't know. No, not particularly," stammered Walters. "I didn't notice anything. I expect it burst when it hit the road." The constable probed the split seam in silence, and then turned hurriedly round to wave away a couple of young women who had stopped to stare. The AA man peered curiously, and then started back with a sensation of sickness. "Ow, Gord!" he gasped. "It's Curly. It's a woman's." "It's not me," screamed Simpkins. "I swear to heaven it's not mine. This man's trying to put it across me." "Me?" gasped Walters. "Me? Why, you filthy murdering brute. I tell you I saw it fall off your carrier. No wonder you blinded off when you saw me coming. Arrest him, constable. Take him away to prison. "Hello, officer," said a voice behind them. "What's all the excitement? You haven't seen a motorcyclist go by with a little bag on his carrier, I suppose?" A big open car with an unnaturally long bonnet had slipped up to them, silent as an owl. The whole agitated party with one accord turned upon the driver. "Would this be it, sir?" The motorist pushed off his goggles, disclosing a long, narrow nose and a pair of rather cynical-looking grey eyes. "It looks rather—" he began, and then, catching sight of the horrid relic protruding from one corner, "In God's name," he inquired, "what's that?" "That's what we'd like to know, sir," said the constable grimly. "Said the motorist.